Her granddaughter rolled her eyes right after pocketing the $20 Eleanor had just handed her. Eleanor Brooks, retired principal and widow, didn't scold her. Sophie, once the shining star of the family, laughed and turned back to her phone. By week's end, her name would vanish from the will, the accounts, and every paper that once promised her a cent. She'd spent a lifetime as the giving grandmother. Now, she was the guardian of her own legacy. And when Sophie came to claim her inheritance, the law itself would answer her. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The cafe smelled faintly of roasted pecans and fresh bread, the kind of scent that usually softened Eleanor's mood. But today she was here for Sophie, her granddaughter, so she picked a table on the patio that overlooked the churning Savannah River. Tugboats passed slowly, their horns low and mournful. Eleanor smoothed her napkin over her lap as Sophie arrived, a minute past noon. The young woman, slid into the chair opposite, phone still in hand, thumbs moving rapidly. "Hi, Grandma," she said without looking up. Eleanor offered a smile anyway. "I ordered sweet tea for both of us. Thought you might like a taste of something besides that canned stuff you drink." Sophie murmured, still typing. They ordered, Eleanor, a chicken salad sandwich, Sophie, an avocado toast that cost more than a decent pair of socks and made small talk that slid around the edges of anything meaningful. Sophie's eyes flicked often toward the street, as though she were scanning for someone she'd rather see. When the check came, Eleanor reached into her purse. She had prepared for this, had tucked a crisp $20 bill into a small envelope the night before. It wasn't much, just a gesture. Gas money, a bit for a coffee between classes, a grandmother's way of saying, "I thought of you." She slid the envelope across the table. "Here you go, sweetheart." Sophie took it, peeled open the flap, glanced inside. Her lips tightened. Then, with a barely concealed sigh, she rolled her eyes and muttered, just loud enough for Eleanor to hear, "That's it?" It was quick, almost throwaway, but the words landed with a sharper edge than Sophie probably intended. Eleanor felt it in her chest, as if someone had closed a door she didn't know was there. Her smile faltered. "It's just a little something," she said, voice even but cooler now. "Not everything has to be big." Sophie didn't meet her gaze. "Thanks," she said flatly, tucking the bill into her phone case. They finished lunch in brittle politeness. The river kept rolling by, and Eleanor watched it instead of her granddaughter. Later that afternoon, Eleanor sat in her sunroom, china teacup warming her palms. Margaret Lane sat across from her, the lamplight catching the silver threads in her friend's hair. Margaret knew how to listen, really listen, and Eleanor needed that. "So," Margaret said, stirring her tea once, "how was lunch with Sophie?" Eleanor hesitated, then told her. Not every word, but enough. The $20, the eye roll, the muttered question. Margaret's brows knit tighter with each detail. "Children these days," Margaret said finally, setting her spoon down with a click. "No sense of proportion, no sense of grace." Eleanor gave a short laugh. "Grace? That's a word she doesn't hear much, I'd bet." She traced the rim of her cup with one finger, then looked up at Margaret with a steady gaze. "What?" Margaret asked, sensing the shift. "I think," Eleanor said slowly, "I just decided something." Margaret leaned forward. "About Sophie?" Eleanor's eyes didn't waver. "About a lot more than Sophie." Outside, the branches of the live oaks swayed in the breeze, casting restless shadows across the porch. Whatever Eleanor had decided, it was no small thing, and the look in her eyes made Margaret set her cup down without taking another sip. Morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Eleanor's study, spilling into long, narrow rectangles across the polished floor. The air held that faint scent of lemon oil from yesterday's dusting, clean but sharp, like a space prepared for serious work. She sat at her desk, its surface perfectly ordered except for the single leather-bound binder resting in the center. The binder was heavy, almost too heavy for one person's life, yet it had followed her faithfully through the decades. First holding mortgage deeds, then insurance policies, and now the sum of everything she would leave behind. Eleanor ran her fingers along the embossed cover before unfastening the brass clasp. The hinges gave a soft sigh, as though they knew secrets were about to be disturbed. Inside, tabs divided her world into neat categories: property, investments, personal letters, and, toward the back, beneficiaries. She turned to that section, her movements deliberate. There, in black ink from a meeting 5 years ago, was Sophie's name, $200,000. The figure sat perfectly aligned on the page, the kind of precision Eleanor had always admired. Only now, the number no longer looked generous. It looked misplaced. She stared at it for a long moment, remembering the sting of Sophie's voice at the cafe. That's it? The dismissal in those 2 words felt sharper now, replaying against the backdrop of this page. Her hand drifted to the phone at the far corner of the desk, an old, corded model, still reliable. She lifted the receiver, dialed the number she knew as well as her own. "Thomas Green," came the familiar baritone. "It's Eleanor Brooks," she said, her voice carrying the same calm she used when addressing the most unruly student in her years as principal. "I need to confirm the current terms of my will." There was the faint shuffle of papers on the other end, the sound of Thomas's methodical search. "Yes. Everything is exactly as last filed. Your daughter, your granddaughter, the charitable gift. Sophie Brooks remains listed for the $200,000. Eleanor traced the printed numbers with one fingertip. "And if I wanted to make changes?" His pause was brief but telling. "You could do so immediately. No restrictions. Are you sure you want to?" "I called you before breakfast," she replied. "I'm sure enough." A low chuckle warmed his voice. "Then I'll prepare the paperwork. Let me know when you'd like to meet." When the line clicked off, Eleanor stayed still, feeling the weight of the decision settle like a stone in the quiet room. Outside, the faint sound of a tour trolley's bell drifted through the open window, a reminder that Savannah kept moving with or without her approval. At 11:30, Margaret arrived. She stepped inside the study, unwrapping a floral scarf from her shoulders. Her sharp eyes went straight to the binder. "Well," Margaret said, lowering herself into the armchair opposite Eleanor's desk. "I see the vault is open." Eleanor closed the cover halfway, letting the leather crease. "I spoke with Thomas. Sophie's still set for the full amount. For now." Margaret leaned back, the corner of her mouth curling upward. "For now. I do love the sound of that." Before Eleanor could respond, the phone rang again. She reached for it, expecting Thomas to confirm a time, but Karen's voice came through instead. Light, almost rehearsed. "Hi, Mom. Just wanted to remind you, Sophie's birthday is next weekend. We thought maybe you'd like to come over, make it special. She's been busy with school, but I know she'd love to see you." Eleanor's eyes slid to the binder again, her finger resting on Sophie's name as if to keep it in place just a little longer. "Yes," she said slowly. "I'll be there." They exchanged the usual polite goodbyes. When Eleanor set the phone down, Margaret raised an eyebrow. "That sounded interesting?" Eleanor closed the binder with a soft thump, the sound carrying more finality than it should have. "Let's just say her birthday might turn out to be more memorable than she expects." Margaret's grin widened. "Now that," she said, "I want a front row seat for." Outside, the live oaks stirred in the wind, their shadows curling like ink across the lawn, a quiet prelude to the changes Eleanor was about to set in motion. 2 mornings before Sophie's birthday, Eleanor left her house early, the air still carrying the cool trace of dawn before Savannah's heat rose. She walked along Whitaker Street, past shop windows waking up to the day, florists propping open their doors, a baker arranging pecan pies in the glass case. She stopped at a small bookstore tucked between a gallery and a cafe. A brass bell above the door chimed softly as she entered. The place smelled faintly of paper, cedar shelves, and brewed coffee from the adjoining counter. "Morning," said the clerk from behind a display of new releases. "I'm looking for something thoughtful," Eleanor replied. "But small, something that says more than it costs." The clerk considered her for a moment, then led her to a corner where slim hardbacks stood in neat rows. Eleanor's hand paused on a cream-colored book embossed with a single gold key, A Little Book of Gratitude. She flipped it open to a page that read, "Gratitude is not a payment. It's a recognition." "That will do," she said, closing it gently. At the counter, she chose understated wrapping, matte paper printed with magnolia blossoms, tied with plain twine. She wrote in her precise hand on a small card, "Wishing you the kind of riches that last." Grandma. No lecture, no underlining. On Saturday, she drove to Karen's townhouse, shaded by two sprawling oaks whose roots pushed the sidewalk into uneven waves. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of vanilla candles. Balloons floated in the living room. A cake, white with gold trim, sat ready on the sideboard. Karen greeted her with a quick hug. "Sophie's just upstairs finishing her hair. She's been so excited." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Has she?" Sophie came down in a white sundress, phone in hand, tapping quickly before slipping it into a tiny gold purse. "Hey, Grandma." She glanced at the wrapped book Eleanor held. "Is that for me?" "It is," Eleanor said, handing it over. Sophie set it on the coffee table without opening it, then moved toward a friend waiting by the cake. The party stayed lively, music playing, friends laughing too loud in the small space. Karen kept a careful balance, moving between guests and glancing at Eleanor often, as if to gauge her temperature. When it came time for gifts, Sophie started with a glossy boutique bag containing sneakers. She squealed and posed for a photo. Next, a stack of gift cards. Finally, she reached for Eleanor's package. The magnolia paper crinkled softly as she unwrapped it. She opened the box, lifted the cream book, and read the title. Her expression flickered. Confusion, then a polite mask. "Oh, a book," she said, voice bright enough for the room. "Cute." She turned it slightly for Karen to see, but angled it so the title was hidden from the camera. "It's a good one," Eleanor said mildly. Sophie set it aside beside the empty wrapping paper, already reaching for the next gift. Eleanor took a sip of sweet tea, saying nothing. After cake and photos, Sophie gave her a quick hug. "Thanks for coming." The words were right. The wait was not. Back home, as the evening light softened, Eleanor set her purse on the counter and hung her jacket by the door. The house felt cool and steady, like it was holding its breath. Her phone buzzed. Margaret's message. "How was the party?" Eleanor typed back, "I'm putting on the kettle, come over." When Margaret arrived, she took her usual chair and waited. "She opened it," Eleanor said. She smiled. "The kind that doesn't touch the eyes?" Margaret asked. "The very kind." Margaret leaned forward. "Did she like it?" Eleanor's gaze drifted to her desk, where her planner lay open to tomorrow. Thomas Green's name and number weighted in neat ink. "She'll appreciate it," Eleanor said, "just not for the reason she thinks." Savannah's morning traffic was light, the brick-paved streets still glistening faintly from an early shower. Eleanor parked just off Broughton Street, sliding her sedan into a narrow spot between a delivery van and a compact car speckled with raindrops. She checked her watch, 15 minutes early. Thomas Green had once told her he appreciated clients who valued punctuality. She'd been on time for 30 years. His office occupied the second floor of an old brick building that had once been a bank. The marble steps were worn smooth in the middle, and the brass door handles had the kind of patina you couldn't fake. Eleanor climbed steadily, heels tapping, and entered a reception area that smelled faintly of leather and old paper. "Mrs. Brooks," the receptionist greeted, standing, "Mr. Green is expecting you. Can I get you some coffee or water?" "Tea, if you have it," Eleanor said, setting her purse neatly on the waiting chair. By the time she was seated in Thomas's office, steam curled from the porcelain cup beside her. Thomas rose from behind his desk, tall and trim in a navy suit, and extended a warm hand. "Eleanor," he said, "always a pleasure." She took the seat across from him, crossing one leg over the other, posture straight as if she were still in her principal's chair. "I'd like to amend my will," she began without preamble. "Today." He didn't flinch. "All right. Which section?" "My granddaughter's allocation," Eleanor said evenly. 200,000. Remove it." Thomas adjusted his glasses. "Permanently?" "Yes." The single syllable landed like a gavel. He reached for a thick file, hers, and flipped to the relevant page. "That changes the distribution considerably. Would you like those funds redirected to an existing beneficiary or to a new one?" "I've been considering the children's literacy charity on Whitaker," Eleanor said, "the one that runs after-school reading programs." Thomas's brows lifted slightly. Clara James's organization? That's the one, Eleanor confirmed. They could make good use of it. He made a note in his precise block lettering. I'll prepare the revised document. You'll need a witness for the signature. Margaret will do it, Eleanor said without hesitation. Thomas smiled faintly. I'll have her sign in the witness section. She's been here before for your power of attorney update, hasn't she? She has, Eleanor said, a thread of amusement in her voice. And she'll probably enjoy today even more. Thomas slid a fresh set of papers from his printer. The sound of the pages stacking was soft but final. He placed them in front of her, angled perfectly. I'll read it through for the record. Eleanor listened as he recited the changes, her eyes on the pen in her hand. It was heavy, black lacquer with a gold tip, Thomas's pen, not hers, and it felt different from the one she'd used 5 years ago when Sophie's name first went on this page. Then it had been a gift. Now it was a reallocation. Margaret arrived 10 minutes later, breezing in with her scarf draped dramatically and the faint scent of lilac trailing behind her. Did I miss the fireworks? You're just in time for the grand finale, Eleanor said. Thomas guided them through the signature lines. Eleanor signed with deliberate strokes, each letter steady. Margaret signed next, her penmanship more hurried but no less certain. Thomas gathered the papers, tapped them into a neat stack, and slid them into a folder marked Final Copy. That's it, he said. The change is official. Sophie Brooks is no longer listed as a beneficiary. The Children's Literacy Fund will receive $200,000 upon your passing. Eleanor stood, smoothing her jacket. Good. Margaret looped her arm through Eleanor's as they left. You know, she said, there are going to be people who think this is ruthless. Eleanor stepped into the sunlight, unbothered. They're welcome to think whatever they like, she said. The street was brighter now, the rain gone, the air clean. But Eleanor's mind was already ahead, picturing Sophie's face when the truth came, how it would land, and how it would last. By Thursday afternoon, the idea had sharpened from possibility into plan. Eleanor decided Sophie wouldn't wait until her grandmother's passing to learn the truth. She would hear it in person, in her grandmother's dining room before life handed her a diploma and the illusion of independence. She phoned Karen that evening, her tone warm but without the cushioning she sometimes used. Sunday night. I'll make dinner, she said. Bring Sophie. Sure, Karen replied, a little surprised. Anything special? Yes, Eleanor said, her favorite. Sunday came soft and overcast, the air in Savannah holding the smell of rain on brick. Eleanor spent the afternoon moving easily through her kitchen, the rhythm of chopping and stirring steadying her mind. She made chicken pot pie the way Sophie liked, crust flaked with butter, filling rich with carrots, peas, and thyme, and baked a peach cobbler, its syrup bubbling up at the edges. The dining table gleamed under a white linen cloth, silver-polished, wine glasses waiting. Karen arrived first, carrying a bouquet. Hydrangeas, she said. Figured they'd look nice on your table. They will, Eleanor said, arranging them in a crystal vase without fuss. Sophie came in behind her, scrolling her phone until she caught the smell from the kitchen. Pot pie? She asked, smiling briefly. That's right, Eleanor said. They sat for dinner, and for a while the conversation skimmed the surface. Classes, weather, a new coffee shop near Sophie's campus. Sophie spoke in practiced sound bites, Karen filling the pauses with polite questions. Eleanor poured wine for Karen and iced tea for Sophie, listening more than talking. She watched the way Sophie's fork slid neatly into the pie, the way her eyes softened when she tasted it. Eleanor let the moment breathe, then set her glass down. Speaking of school, she began, her voice casual, I've been doing some estate planning updates. Karen looked up, curious but cautious. Oh? Just making sure everything's in order, Eleanor said. You know how important it is to keep those things current. Sophie barely glanced up from her plate. That's good, I guess. Eleanor folded her napkin in half. You're both mentioned in my will, of course. At least you were. Karen's brows knit slightly. Were? Eleanor held Sophie's gaze. You're no longer in my will, Sophie. The words settled into the air like a dropped stone breaking still water. Sophie's fork paused midair. Karen's mouth opened, then closed, her eyes darting between them. "What?" Sophie said finally, a laugh catching in her throat. "You're joking." "I'm not," Eleanor replied, her tone as steady as if she were confirming the day's date. Sophie stared at her, then gave a sharp, incredulous laugh. "You're cutting me out? Over what? That $20? "This isn't about $20, Eleanor said. "It's about respect, and the fact that I've decided my money can do more good elsewhere." Karen set her glass down with more force than necessary. "Mom, this is extreme. Sophie's young. She doesn't always think before she speaks." "She's 21, Eleanor said. "Old enough to understand gratitude, and old enough to live without expecting my estate to be her safety net." For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the wall clock. Sophie pushed her plate back, untouched pie still steaming. "Well," she said finally, "if you want to be petty, that's on you." Eleanor took a sip of tea, unruffled. "Petty is letting someone behave however they wish and still rewarding them for it. I'm simply making choices that align with my values." Karen exhaled sharply, shaking her head. This is unbelievable." "Believe it," Eleanor said quietly. The room felt smaller, the lamplight sharper. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the branches against the window. Eleanor sat straighter, not flinching from either woman's gaze. She had chosen her moment, and she had taken it. What came next would unfold however it needed to, but Sophie now knew, and that knowledge, Eleanor suspected, would linger longer than any inheritance ever could. For a heartbeat after Eleanor's words landed, the only movement in the room was Sophie's fork, sliding from her fingers and striking the china plate with a sharp clink. Her mouth hung open, the beginnings of a protest trapped in her throat. Karen recovered first. "Why?" she demanded, her voice tight and rising in pitch. "Why would you do something like this?" Eleanor folded her napkin into a neat square before answering. "Because, Karen, there are things in this life more important than money. Respect, for one. Gratitude. The ability to treat people well without expecting a payout." "That's rich," Sophie snapped, finding her voice. "You're seriously cutting me out because I didn't grovel over a $20 bill?" Eleanor's eyes didn't flicker. "It wasn't the bill. It was the reaction. A reaction that told me more than you probably intended." "That is ridiculous," Sophie said, pushing her chair back. "You're overreacting. People roll their eyes all the time. It doesn't mean anything." "It meant something to me," Eleanor said. She lifted her glass of iced tea, the condensation cooling her fingers, and took a slow sip. The gesture wasn't hurried, wasn't defensive. It was the kind of measured pause that left no doubt the decision was final. Karen leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Mom, this is Sophie, your granddaughter. She's young, she's learning. You're just going to punish her like this?" "This isn't punishment," Eleanor replied evenly. "It's course correction. I've spent my whole life teaching people to recognize what matters. Sophie has made it clear she values appearances and convenience over substance. I don't have to endorse that." "You make it sound like I'm some villain," Sophie said. "I'm making it sound like you have choices," Eleanor corrected, "and this one," she gestured between them, "was mine." The room seemed to contract. The steady tick of the wall clock was suddenly loud, marking each second Sophie didn't speak. Finally, she crossed her arms and leaned back, her jaw tight. "You know what? Fine. Keep your money. I'll be just fine without it." Eleanor gave a faint, knowing smile. "I hope you will." Karen sighed heavily and reached for her purse. "I think we'd better go." No hugs were exchanged at the door. Sophie brushed past without looking back, the hem of her dress swaying sharply with each step. Karen lingered for a moment, her expression somewhere between hurt and frustration, but she said nothing more before following her daughter into the damp Savannah night. When the house was quiet again, Eleanor returned to the dining room, clearing the plates in calm, efficient movements. She wrapped the untouched peach cobbler, placing it in the refrigerator. The hydrangeas sat in their vase at the table's center, their blue petals vivid against the white cloth. Her phone rang just as she was drying the last wineglass. The name Margaret lit up the screen. "Well?" Margaret's voice was eager, conspiratorial. "Did you do it?" Eleanor sank into her armchair, cradling the phone between shoulder and ear. I did, right after dessert, or rather instead of dessert. And? The reaction, Eleanor said, was exactly what I expected. Sophie's eyes went wide. Karen demanded to know why. Sophie accused me of overreacting, and I calmly drank my tea. Margaret gave a low, satisfied laugh. Oh, I wish I'd been there. Part of me wishes you had, Eleanor admitted. It was clarifying. There was a pause on the line, the kind where you can almost hear the other person leaning forward. And now? Margaret asked. Eleanor glanced toward the study where the binder rested quietly in its drawer. Now, she said, we wait for the ripple. Margaret chuckled. Oh, there'll be a ripple. Eleanor looked out the window at the darkened street, the lamplight catching the wet pavement. Somewhere, faint and distant, she could hear the river's low hum. I'm counting on it, she said softly. By Monday morning, the messages began. The first came before Eleanor's coffee had even finished brewing. Karen's voice filled the kitchen from the machine's speaker. Mom, we need to talk about last night. Call me back, please. This can't be how things end. She pressed delete. 2 hours later, another. I think you're making a mistake. Sophie's upset. I'm upset. Let's just hit pause, okay? Delete. By evening, the messages had stacked like a row of dominoes in her voicemail folder, each one leaning harder than the last. The tone shifted from coaxing to clipped, from, let's talk this out to you're being stubborn. Eleanor listened to each one in full, not because she was swayed, but because she believed in hearing people out, especially when she knew she wouldn't respond. On Tuesday, the email arrived. Sophie's name glared from the subject line in bold letters. The message was long, paragraphs stacked like small defenses. Sophie explained that she was stressed with school, that she hadn't meant anything by that look, that she couldn't believe her own grandmother would judge her for one tiny moment. She accused Eleanor of misunderstanding her, of letting Margaret poison her perception. Eleanor read it twice, eyes steady, and then closed the laptop. The reply field stayed empty. By Thursday, the calls slowed, replaced by Karen's short text messages. Please just talk to her. This isn't worth it. Eleanor left those unread. That afternoon, Margaret stopped by with a paper bag of pastries and the look of someone prepared to do a little damage control. Any progress? She asked, sliding into her usual chair. Eleanor poured tea. If by progress you mean they're exhausting themselves, then yes. Margaret grinned. You don't have to sit here listening to the waves crash on your voicemail, you know. Where else would I go? Eleanor asked, though she knew the answer before Margaret opened her mouth. Tybee, Margaret said. Couple of days by the ocean. Salt air, seafood, and you can leave your phone in a drawer. Eleanor thought of the broad beaches, the gulls wheeling overhead, the way the horizon could hold your attention until all the small-town noise fell away. That, she said, is an excellent idea. By Friday, she had booked a small cottage on the quieter end of the island, a weathered place with blue shutters and a porch swing. She packed lightly, linen pants, soft cardigans, a wide-brimmed hat, and a single novel she had been meaning to read for months. The drive out was easy, the marshes on either side catching the late afternoon light like sheets of gold. By the time she pulled into the sandy drive, the air had changed. Saltier, cleaner, the kind that filled your lungs and left no room for anyone else's opinions. That evening, Eleanor sat on the porch with a plate of shrimp and grits, watching the tide pull back. The rhythmic hush of waves smoothed the edges of the past week's conversations until they felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. In the morning, she walked the length of the beach, the damp sand firm under her feet. A few early risers passed with nods, but no one asked her to explain herself. No one asked her to reconsider. She breathed deep, letting the air fill her chest, and thought about how small even $200,000 seemed against the enormity of the ocean. When she returned to the cottage, the phone on the side table flashed with new messages. Eleanor glanced at it once, then turned it face down. The gulls outside called to one another over the surf, and she listened to them instead. The ocean, she decided, had more to say worth hearing. Eleanor was halfway through her second cup of tea on Monday morning when the phone rang. The caller ID showed Thomas Green. She picked up immediately. "Morning, Eleanor," Thomas began, his voice calm but tinged with something that sounded like amusement. "I thought you'd want to know. I had a visitor this morning." She didn't need to ask who. "Sophie." "That's right. She walked in without an appointment, said it was urgent. My receptionist almost called me out of a client meeting." Eleanor smiled faintly into her cup. "And what did she want?" "To plead her case," Thomas said. "She opened with the argument that she's family, and family should be taken care of. Then she tried explaining away whatever it was that led to your decision. Something about stress, deadlines, and a misunderstanding over a gift." Eleanor leaned back in her chair. "Ah, the revised history version." "She was insistent," he continued, "but I reminded her that the will is your legal document. Only you can make changes, and you've already made them. I told her my professional role doesn't include negotiating between family members. I imagine that didn't go over well." "Not especially," Thomas admitted. "She left abruptly. No handshake, no goodbye." Eleanor felt no surge of guilt, no twinge of second-guessing, only a quiet gratitude for Thomas's steady boundaries. "Thank you for handling it with professionalism," she said. "That's my job," Thomas replied, "but I thought you'd appreciate hearing it from me rather than secondhand." After they hung up, Eleanor sat in the quiet of her kitchen for a few moments, listening to the faint tick of the wall clock. Sophie's attempt hadn't surprised her, but the speed of it had. Less than a week after the dinner, and she was already trying to undo the decision. By late morning, Margaret arrived, carrying a canvas tote that clinked suspiciously. "I brought scones," she announced, "and possibly a small bottle of champagne in case you felt like toasting your own resilience." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "It's not my birthday." "No," Margaret said, unpacking the baked goods, "but I hear from a reliable source, named Thomas, that Sophie tried storming the gates." "She did," Eleanor confirmed, buttering a scone, "and she left no better off than when she arrived." Margaret's eyes sparkled. "All the more reason to celebrate. But tell me, have you thought about making your little change public?" Eleanor paused mid-spread. "Public?" "Yes," Margaret said, settling across from her. "Announce it at one of those charity events. Let people know you're supporting the literacy program in a big way. It's not about humiliating Sophie. It's about inspiring others, showing what you believe in." Eleanor considered the idea, her mind turning it over like a smooth stone. She pictured a crowded room, applause ringing, Clara from the charity beaming at the news. She also pictured Sophie, somewhere out there, reading about it in the paper instead of hearing it through the family grapevine. "It would certainly make the point," Eleanor said slowly. "It's not about a point," Margaret countered. "It's about a legacy. But yes, it might make a point along the way." Eleanor smiled faintly, setting her teacup down. "I'll think about it." Margaret leaned forward, her tone conspiratorial. "Think fast. There's a fundraiser next week. Perfect timing." Outside, a breeze stirred the hydrangeas in the yard, their petals shifting in the light. Eleanor found herself watching them as if they might answer the question for her. "Next week," she repeated. "That might just work." Margaret grinned. "I'll find something to wear." Eleanor looked back toward the phone, imagining the ripple Thomas had mentioned. If she made the gift public, that ripple would turn into a wave, and Sophie would have no choice but to watch it roll in. The Whitaker Street Community Hall had been transformed into something close to elegant. White tablecloths draped over round tables, votive candles flickering in glass cups, and a small jazz trio warming the room with soft notes. Eleanor arrived with Margaret on her arm, both in dark evening jackets that stood out against the sea of brighter dresses. Clara James spotted them instantly, making her way through the mingling guests with a smile. "You made it," she said, squeezing Eleanor's hands. "This means the world to us." "I'm glad to be here," Eleanor replied, her voice as steady as the decision she'd carried in her pocket all week. Margaret leaned in. "We're in for a memorable evening." The fundraiser began with the usual speeches, updates on programs, a short video of children reading aloud in the library corner, testimonials from parents. Eleanor listened, eyes scanning the room. She saw faces of people she'd taught decades ago, now older, wiser, still leaning forward when something important was being said. When Clara took the stage again to introduce the evening's final segment, she glanced at Eleanor. "Before we close," she said into the microphone, "we have a very special friend here tonight who's agreed to say a few words." A quiet ripple went through the crowd. Eleanor rose, walking with the measured steps of someone who knows exactly what she's about to do. At the podium, she rested her hands lightly on the wood. "I won't keep you long," she began, her voice carrying easily. "I've lived in Savannah my whole life, and I've seen many good things start with a single act of generosity. Tonight, I want to make one of my own." She paused just long enough to see heads turn, conversations halt. "Effective immediately, I've arranged for a bequest of $200,000 to the Children's Literacy Fund. It's not just money. It's an investment in curiosity, in opportunity, and in the idea that every child in this city should have the tools to read their own future." For a moment the room held its breath. Then applause broke out, first polite, then swelling into something that echoed against the high ceiling. Clara's hands were over her mouth, her eyes shining. Margaret clapped hard enough to sting. Eleanor stepped back, allowing Clara to reclaim the podium, and returned to her seat to a chorus of nods and murmured thanks from passing guests. By the next morning, the Savannah Gazette had run the story online. Retired principal pledges $200,000 to Literacy Fund. The photo showed Eleanor and Clara side by side, both smiling. The article praised the gift, noted Eleanor's decades of service in education, and quoted her line about reading your own future. She was on her second reading of the piece when her phone lit up with Karen's name. "Mom?" Karen's voice was tight, clipped. "Sophie just saw the article." "I imagine she did," Eleanor said, her tone mild. "You blindsided her, blindsided both of us. You didn't think this was something we should have been told privately?" "This wasn't about you," Eleanor replied. "It was about the charity." Karen exhaled sharply. "You've humiliated her. Everyone is going to know she lost that money." "I haven't told anyone why," Eleanor said. "If she chooses to share that, it's her decision." Karen muttered something under her breath before hanging up without goodbye. Eleanor set the phone down, the applause from the night before still humming faintly in her ears. By early evening, she'd almost forgotten the call, until the doorbell rang. The chime echoed through the front hall. Eleanor opened the door to find Sophie standing on the porch, rain dripping from her hair, eyes sharp and unreadable. "We need to talk," Sophie said, stepping forward without waiting for an invitation. Sophie stepped into the hallway without waiting to be asked, her wet shoes leaving dark prints on the hardwood. Her hair clung in damp strands to her cheeks, and she smelled faintly of rain and sharp perfume. "I want you to take it back," she said, turning to face Eleanor. "The thing with the will, the announcement, all of it." Eleanor shut the door with a calm click. "That's not going to happen." Sophie's jaw tightened. "You don't understand what you've done. People are talking. My friend's parents read that article. They're asking me questions. I look like—" She stopped, pressing her lips together. "Like what?" Eleanor asked evenly. "Like someone who wasn't worth keeping in her own grandmother's will," Sophie said, her voice breaking on the last word. Eleanor kept her tone level. "I made a choice that reflects my values. The charity will use that money to help children who've had far fewer opportunities than you." "That's great for them," Sophie shot back. "But you've ruined things for me. Do you have any idea how this makes me look?" "This isn't about how you look," Eleanor said, moving toward the kitchen. "Would you like to sit down?" "I don't want tea, Grandma," Sophie said, following her. "I want you to call your lawyer and undo it." Eleanor paused at the counter, resting one hand on the back of a chair. "Sophie, I won't be changing the will, and if public perception matters more to you than the reason behind my decision, then we've reached the heart of the problem." Sophie's eyes shimmered. She blinked fast, the moisture gathering until it spilled over. "I'm trying here. I came all the way over in the rain to—" "To what?" Eleanor asked. "Persuade me with tears? This isn't about whether you can cry on cue, it's about whether you can live with the consequences of your own actions." "That's cold," Sophie whispered, swiping at her cheeks. "It's honest," Eleanor said. They stood in the quiet, the rain tapping against the windows. Sophie's breathing was uneven, her shoulders tight. "I don't think I can forgive you for this," she said finally. "That is your choice," Eleanor replied, her voice still calm. The doorbell rang. Sophie turned sharply, clearly not expecting company. Eleanor opened the door to find Margaret on the porch, carrying a tote bag and wearing her usual faint smirk. "Well," Margaret said, stepping in and shaking off her umbrella, "this feels tense." Sophie glanced at her, then back to Eleanor. "You told her?" "I tell Margaret most things," Eleanor said. "She's my friend." Margaret set the tote on the counter, her eyes flicking between them like she was catching the end of a play. "Should I come back later or—" "No," Sophie said quickly, her voice rising. "I'm leaving." She grabbed her purse from the chair and strode toward the door, her heels clicking in sharp staccato. "Enjoy your little victory, Grandma." Eleanor didn't move to stop her. The front door opened, then closed with a firm thud. Margaret waited a beat, then arched one eyebrow. "Tea?" Eleanor exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. "Yes," she said. "Tea." Margaret began unpacking the tote. Scones, lemon curd, a jar of blackberry jam. "She'll be back," she said. "Maybe," Eleanor replied, reaching for the kettle. "But I won't be." Margaret's head tilted. "Meaning?" Eleanor turned the burner on, the blue flame catching. "Meaning that was her last attempt to sway me. Next time, it won't be a discussion." By Wednesday morning, Eleanor was enjoying the quiet. The kettle hummed, the hydrangeas nodded in a light breeze outside, and she was halfway through the crossword when Margaret's text buzzed in, "Check Facebook." Now, she opened her laptop, the glow of the screen cutting through the calm. There it was, Sophie's post. "It's always the people you think you can count on. My own grandmother decided I wasn't worth a penny of her estate, but she made sure to brag about giving it away for attention. I guess blood isn't thicker than her bank account. Stingy, such a family betrayal." The comments were already stacking up, classmates offering sympathy, acquaintances asking vague questions, one friend adding a row of angry emojis. Eleanor read the post twice. Her heartbeat didn't change. She clicked into the comment box and began typing, not to argue but to correct. For those who are curious, the decision to support the Children's Literacy Fund was made after much thought. The gift will provide books, tutoring, and educational opportunities to children who might otherwise go without. I have nothing against my granddaughter personally, but I believe in using my resources where they can do the most good. I won't be discussing private family matters further. She hit post. No hashtags, no exclamation marks, just the facts. The ripple was immediate. Old colleagues left comments praising her dedication to education. Neighbors she hadn't seen in years shared memories of her reading to their children in the school library. One former student wrote simply, "You taught me how to read. Thank you for teaching me this too." By late afternoon, her response had been shared enough times that Sophie's post was buried under an avalanche of support for the charity. The narrative had shifted, and it was clear to anyone scrolling which story held weight. That evening, Margaret appeared at the door, holding up her phone like a trophy. "You've gone viral, at least in Savannah terms. Half the city's patting you on the back, and the other half's suddenly very interested in children's literacy." Eleanor poured her a glass of iced tea. "It's not a contest, Margaret." "Sure it is," Margaret said, settling into the armchair. "And you're winning." By Friday, Karen's social media accounts were gone. No posts, no profile picture, just blank pages where her defenses had been. Eleanor noticed only because Margaret mentioned it over lunch at the cafe. "Guess she didn't like the comments," Margaret said, stirring her coffee. "She'll be back," Eleanor said. "They usually are." That afternoon, a cream-colored envelope arrived in the mail. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar but careful. Inside was a short letter on thick stationery. "Dear Mrs. Brooks, I saw the article about your gift and wanted to thank you. Our program runs on the generosity of people who believe every child deserves a fair start. Your courage to do what you believe is right, even when it's not easy, is inspiring. With gratitude, Clara James." Eleanor read it twice before setting it beside the phone. She'd had thank you notes before, but this one felt like a quiet anchor in a week of loud ripples. The next morning, Margaret arrived with a wide, flat package wrapped in brown paper. "For you," she said, grinning. Inside was the Savannah Gazette clipping from the fundraiser, matted in cream and framed in dark wood. The headline, "Retired Principal Pledges $200,000 to Literacy Fund," sat proudly above the photo of Eleanor and Clara. "Thought you might like to keep the record straight," Margaret said. Eleanor ran a hand over the glass, the smooth coolness grounding her. "It'll go in the study," she said. "Some things deserve to be remembered exactly as they happened." She hung it on the wall that afternoon, opposite the desk where the binder rested in its drawer. The paper caught the light from the window, the black print sharp against the white mat. Outside, a car slowed in front of the house, idling just long enough for Eleanor to notice. The air in Thomas Green's office always smelled faintly of leather and something warm, cedar perhaps, and that morning was no different. Eleanor sat opposite his desk, the sunlight from the tall window cutting across the stack of papers between them. Thomas adjusted his glasses and tapped the top page. "This," he said, "is the final legal transfer document. Once you sign, the Children's Literacy Fund will receive official notice, and the bequest will be locked into place." Eleanor picked up his black lacquer pen. Its weight felt familiar now, like the last step in a long walk. She read the first paragraph again, letting the clean, unambiguous words settle in her mind. Then, with steady strokes, she signed her name, Eleanor Brooks, 3 times in the spaces provided. Thomas gathered the pages, adding his own signature with the brisk precision of a man who'd done this hundreds of times. "That's it," he said, his voice final but warm. "The change is now beyond contest." "Good," Eleanor replied. She glanced toward the door, half expecting Sophie to materialize out of thin air. But the only sound was the muted hum of the building's air conditioner. They spoke briefly about the charity's timeline, how Clara James would be notified within the day, how a formal acknowledgement letter would follow. Thomas assured her the law was on her side, ironclad. When Eleanor stepped out into the morning light, Margaret was waiting at the curb in her little navy hatchback, sunglasses perched on her head. "All done?" she asked as Eleanor slid into the passenger seat. "All done," Eleanor said. "Then we're celebrating." Margaret drove them to a bistro on the edge of the historic district, a place with striped awnings and outdoor tables shaded by wide umbrellas. The waitress seated them near the railing, where they could watch the foot traffic, tourists in floppy hats, locals walking dogs, the occasional horse-drawn carriage rolling by. They ordered crab cakes and a bottle of chilled white wine. Margaret raised her glass once it arrived. "To decisions," she said, "and to sticking with them." Eleanor touched her glass to Margaret's, "to putting things in their proper place." Over lunch, they talked about everything but Sophie. The conversation meandered through books they meant to read, a neighbor's new landscaping project, the merits of lemon tart versus pecan pie. It felt easy, unweighted. Afterward, they walked along the river. The air was warm but breezy, the water reflecting a fractured patchwork of sky and cloud. Street musicians played soft blues, and the scent of roasted pecans drifted from a vendor's cart. They stopped at the railing, watching a tugboat nudge a container ship out toward the open water. Margaret leaned on her elbows. "So," she said, "how does it feel?" "Peaceful," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the immediacy of the word. "Like I've put something back where it belongs." Margaret smiled. "I like that." They stood there for a while, not speaking, just letting the rhythm of the river fill the space between them. When Eleanor returned home later that afternoon, the house felt unusually still. The framed Gazette clipping caught the late light, the black print bold against the mat. She set her purse down and crossed to the study, opening the drawer where the binder sat. The will was no longer just a document, it was a reflection of her priorities, made tangible in ink and witnessed hands. She closed the drawer with a quiet click. From somewhere outside, a car door shut. Eleanor glanced toward the window but saw nothing beyond the shifting shadows of the live oaks. The email arrived early on a Tuesday morning, its subject line plain, "Update from the Children's Literacy Fund." Eleanor clicked it and found a brief message from Clara James. "Eleanor, we'd like to honor your gift publicly by creating the Eleanor Brooks Reading Fund. Please join us at the unveiling this Friday. With gratitude, Clara." Eleanor read it twice, her coffee cooling beside her. She'd known the bequest would be put to work, but she hadn't expected them to name anything after her. Friday afternoon brought her back to the same Whitaker Street Community Hall, though this time the room was set with a podium and a covered sign at the front. Clara greeted her warmly, steering her toward the first row. When the speeches began, Eleanor listened quietly as Clara spoke about the fund's mission, providing books to home libraries, sponsoring reading tutors, stocking mobile book vans for neighborhoods without easy access to libraries. "We believe," Clara said, "that every child deserves a chance to hold their own story in their hands." Then, with a small flourish, Clara pulled the cloth from the sign. In gold letters against a navy background, it read, "The Eleanor Brooks Reading Fund." The applause was warm and genuine, rising like a wave across the room. Cameras clicked. A reporter from the Savannah Gazette jotted notes in a small spiral pad. Clara beckoned Eleanor to join her at the podium, but Eleanor simply smiled and shook her head, choosing to let the moment belong to the children the fund would serve. By the next morning, the Gazette ran the story online. "Retired Principal's Gift Creates New Literacy Fund." A photo showed Clara standing beside the gleaming sign, with Eleanor in the background, half smiling. The article praised her decades in education, quoted Clara on the fund's goals, and detailed the programs already in motion. Sophie said nothing, not online, not in any message Eleanor could see. The silence was almost louder than the outburst Eleanor had once expected. Karen, however, broke the quiet with a text. "I hope you're happy. You've made your point. No greeting, no signature." Eleanor read it once, then pressed delete without replying. That afternoon, she clipped the Gazette article from the paper and slid it into the folder in her desk labeled Important Papers, the same drawer that held her will, the binder, and the framed letter from Clara. That evening, Margaret came over with a bottle of Prosecco tucked under one arm and a box of pastries from the bakery near the square. She popped the cork with a satisfying pop, filling 2 fluted glasses. "To a legacy well placed," Margaret said, raising hers. Eleanor touched her glass to Margaret's, the delicate chime sounding in the quiet room. "To making sure it outlives me." They sipped in companionable silence for a while. Outside, the evening light turned the hydrangeas a deeper blue, and somewhere down the street a wind chime answered the breeze. Margaret set her glass down. "So, what's next?" Eleanor looked at her over the rim of her glass. "Next?" "Yes," Margaret said, leaning forward. "You've made your statement. The fund's in motion. Do you stop here, or do you keep going?" Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the window, where the street lamps were just beginning to glow. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "about a scholarship program. Something for students with financial need and a record of helping their communities. Not just good grades, good hearts." Margaret's eyebrows rose. "That's significant." "I'd like it to be," Eleanor said. "It wouldn't take away from the fund, but it would mean more opportunities and perhaps more gratitude in the right places." Margaret's grin was slow and wide. "You do realize this will drive certain people absolutely mad?" "I'm aware," Eleanor said, her voice almost serene. She topped off their glasses, the bubbles catching the light. "If I'm going to spend my money, Margaret, I'd rather spend it shaping the future than cushioning someone else's complacency." Margaret raised her glass again. "Then here's to your next move." Eleanor clinked hers gently, feeling the decision settle in her chest like a promise already made. The following Monday, Eleanor sat at the long oak table in Clara James's office, the surface scattered with notepads, draft guidelines, and 2 steaming mugs of coffee. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, turning the floating dust into a soft haze. "All right," Clara said, flipping open her notebook. "If this scholarship is going to carry your name, I want it to reflect exactly what matters most to you." Eleanor didn't hesitate. Financial need and service to others. Not just a resume full of grades and clubs. I want students who've made a difference, who've chosen to act when no one told them to. Clara's pen scratched across the page. Community involvement, leadership without a title, got it. Should we set an age limit? High school seniors heading to college, Eleanor said. Savannah residents, and if they've ever volunteered in a literacy program, even better. They spent 2 hours drafting the criteria, minimum GPA, proof of financial need, at least one letter of recommendation from someone outside the applicant's family. Clara suggested a short essay prompt. Describe a time you took action to help your community and what you learned from it. Eleanor approved immediately. Applications open to the public next month, Clara said, smiling as she gathered the papers. We'll set up an online portal and paper forms for anyone without internet access. Do you want to announce it at the spring fundraiser? Yes, Eleanor said, but let's not wait for the applications to come in before we make noise about it. The right students need to know early. 3 weeks later, Eleanor sat in her sunroom with Margaret, the coffee table between them piled with printed applications. The late morning light slanted across the room, catching on the edge of Margaret's reading glasses. Here's one, Margaret said, holding up a page. Single mom, part-time job, still volunteers every Saturday at the food bank, wants to major in social work. Eleanor took it, reading the handwritten essay. The sentences were plain, but the sincerity was unmistakable. She set it in the growing, strong candidate pile. Some stories made her pause longer than others. A boy who had organized a used book drive for his elementary school, a girl who had taught her younger brother to read after their father left, using only library books and patience, another who had built a community garden in an empty lot, then convinced the city to keep it maintained. They've done more at 17 than some adults do in a lifetime, Eleanor murmured. Margaret smiled. You're softening. It's not soft, Eleanor said, but there was warmth in her tone. It's clarity. By the third day of reviewing, the stack of strong candidates was far taller than she'd expected. We were supposed to choose one award, she said, glancing at the neat column of names in her notebook. I don't think I can. Margaret arched an eyebrow. So don't. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the hum of the ceiling fan filling the pause. If I funded 2 scholarships instead of 1, could we manage it? She asked Clara over the phone later that afternoon. Easily, Clara said. It would double the impact and send a clear message about what you value. The decision was made before the call ended. A week later, the official announcement went live. The Eleanor Brooks Scholarship will award $10,000 each to 2 graduating seniors in Savannah who demonstrate both financial need and exceptional service to their communities. The press release included a quote from Eleanor about investing in those who invest in others, and within hours, local radio stations were mentioning it between traffic updates and weather reports. That evening, Eleanor stood at her kitchen counter, sorting the last batch of applications into neat piles. Margaret was on her way over with dinner, and the hydrangeas outside the window glowed faintly in the fading light. She closed the final folder, feeling the same quiet satisfaction she'd felt when she signed the will. Only this time, it wasn't about removing someone. It was about choosing who to lift. From the front porch came the crunch of tires on gravel, but when Eleanor glanced out, the vehicle idling at the curb wasn't Margaret's little hatchback. It was Sophie's silver sedan. The community hall had been dressed for celebration, rows of folding chairs lined in neat symmetry, a long table along one wall draped in white cloth and dotted with trays of tea sandwiches, lemonade, and coffee urns. On the small stage at the front, a banner read, "The Eleanor Brooks Scholarship Award Ceremony" in clean navy letters. Margaret was already there when Eleanor arrived, bustling between the seats with her camera hanging from a strap around her neck. "Front row's yours," she said, steering Eleanor forward. "I'm not letting you hide in the back for this one." Eleanor smoothed the hem of her linen jacket as she sat, scanning the growing crowd. Students in their best dresses and pressed shirts clutched programs. Parents leaned toward one another in hushed conversation. Clara moved briskly between groups, checking her notes, her smile a constant anchor. When the program began, Clara stepped to the podium. "Tonight," she said, "we honor 2 students whose commitment to their communities and perseverance in the face of challenge exemplify everything this scholarship stands for." Eleanor listened as Clara spoke about the selection process, careful to keep her expression steady when she heard the sheer number of applicants again, more than 100 in just the first year. "First," Clara said, "please welcome Mariah Daniels." A young woman in a navy dress approached the stage. Her posture was straight, but her eyes darted quickly over the crowd until they landed on Eleanor. Mariah's essay had detailed years of helping her younger siblings with homework while working evenings at a grocery store. She had written about turning down social invitations to save bus fare and still managing to organize a coat drive at her high school. Clara handed her a certificate and an envelope. Mariah took the microphone briefly, her voice soft but unwavering. "I didn't think anyone noticed the little things I've been doing. Ms. Brooks, you noticed. Thank you for seeing me." The second recipient, Jacob Ruiz, was taller than Eleanor expected, his tie slightly askew. His application had described fixing up abandoned bicycles to give to neighborhood kids and teaching them how to ride. He spoke about wanting to study mechanical engineering, not just to design things, but to make them accessible to people who couldn't afford them. When both students had returned to their seats, Clara called Eleanor to the stage. "I'm not much for speeches," Eleanor began, her hands lightly resting on the podium, "but I will say this. Mariah and Jacob are proof that real wealth isn't about what you keep, but what you give. I'm proud to have my name on this scholarship, but I'm prouder still of the names printed on those certificates tonight." She stepped down, and Mariah was there waiting, eyes shining. "Thank you," the girl whispered, wrapping her in a hug that was both careful and fierce. Jacob shook her hand firmly, his other hand gripping the envelope like it might slip away. "This changes everything for me," he said. Margaret's camera clicked softly, catching the handshake, the hug, the small but unmistakable shift in Eleanor's expression. Afterward, people lingered, the air thick with congratulations and laughter. Parents thanked her with handshakes and warm eyes. Students shyly asked if they could take a picture with her. Margaret flitted around the edges, capturing every angle, her smile as wide as if she'd won the award herself. By the time the crowd thinned, the hall smelled faintly of brewed coffee and wilting flowers. Eleanor stood near the stage, looking at the now empty chairs. The noise had faded, but the warmth in the room lingered. Margaret joined her, tucking the camera into its case. "You know," she said, "if I didn't know the story, I'd never guess this all started with a $20 bill." Eleanor let out a quiet laugh, though her eyes stayed on the stage. She remembered Sophie's face at that lunch, the raised brow, the small curl of disdain in her mouth, and how, in that moment, something inside her had simply set. Now, in the same city, in another room, two young people stood taller because she'd chosen to see them, because she'd decided her money could buy books, tuition, tools, things that could last longer than a fleeting expression. Margaret slipped her arm through Eleanor's. "Ready to go?" Eleanor nodded, taking one last look around the hall. "Respect is worth more than money," she said quietly, almost to herself, "and it's the only thing I spend freely."